Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Morgan Library and Museum, and we are very excited about this evening's lecture. I'm Colin Bailey, the Catherine J. Rayner Director of the Morgan Library and Museum, and it is a real pleasure to welcome my colleague and my friend Francesca Cappelletti, who is the Director of the Galleria Borghese. And it's really all thanks to her that we have this fantastic loan, which remains on view until April 19th. Our galleries tonight are open until 8 o'clock. So if you hadn't seen The Boy with the Basket of Fruit before the lecture, you can see it after, or even if you did see it before, you can see it again. Also on view until April 19th are Giovanni Bellini's Pietà Restored, thanks to Venetian Heritage, and Pietro Perugino's Man of Sorrows from the National Gallery of Umbria in Perugia. Both of these loans remain on view until roughly the same period. Caravaggio's Boy with a Basket of Fruit, which is a beautifully focused exhibition around this marvelous loan, has been organized by John Marchari, who's our Director of Curatorial Affairs, and the exhibition has garnered tremendous enthusiasm and very good press, absolutely deservedly, and I'm delighted to see how many people are looking so closely, not only at Caravaggio, but also at his predecessors, some of the artists he influenced. We're able to have this exhibition in part thanks to our colleagues at FIAC, the Foundation for Italian Art and Culture, who are long-standing partners. The president of the foundation, Daniele Bordini, is with us this evening, and perhaps Alain Elkan is as well, I'm not quite sure, but we have a long friendship, and we have had several projects thanks to them. The exhibition is supported primarily by Gil and Ildiko Butler and the Italian Foundation for Art and Culture. Our guest this evening, we're very grateful to her for coming over from Rome, is Francesca Cappelletti, who was appointed director of the Galleria Borghese in Rome in 2020. The gallery is always full, so it doesn't need any real publicity, but it is one of the most beautiful museums in the world, and anyone who loves old master painting and 19th century and Canova visits it, and I'm sure many of you have visited it. They're a home for Caravaggio, but The Boy with the Basket of Fruit is still one of their great treasures. Francesca is also professor of the history of modern art at the University of Ferrara. She is an acclaimed Caravaggio specialist. She was the co-curator of the exhibition in 2025 at the Palazzo Barberini in Rome. I'm sure many people were able to see that. Interestingly, the portrait, Caravaggio's portrait of Maffeo Barberini, who became Pope Urban VIII, was just acquired by the Italian government and has been placed at the Palazzo Barberini. This was a picture that was shown in her exhibition last year. She studied in Rome at La Sapienza, in London at the Warburg, and in Paris at the Collège de France. She was also deeply involved in the rediscovery of Caravaggio's Taking of Christ, a painting that was rediscovered some years ago in Dublin. And in the course of her career, she's done many, many projects. I'm not going to list them this evening, all to say, though, that she really is one of the most eminent Caravaggio specialists, and we are delighted to welcome her this evening. So please do so. Thank you.
So, thank you so much for this most generous introduction, and thank you for this wonderful exhibition with such an intelligent and in-depth focus on The Boy with the Basket of Fruit in all its implications, from the Lombard roots of still life to its combination with the portrait of anonymous figures that precise depiction of characters who do not aspire to official portraiture, but lend their faces and expressions to the boys painted in white shirts by Caravaggio and Annibale Carracci. Today, we shall return to Caravaggio's Roman years and the context in which The Boy with the Basket of Fruit originated, where his work unfolded before what we rightly consider the Caravaggio Revolution, a now and dramatic language based on the contrast between light and shadow, on color as a defining element of composition, and, above all, on the use of the life model. Caravaggio painted with the natural before him. He brought models onto the canvas that seemed real, in which flesh, blood, pallor, beauty and youth, deformity and old age imposed themselves on the viewer gaze. This new way of painting was really impressive for his contemporaries, and Karel van Mander, a painter himself and a biographer, tells us in 1604 that all the young painters in Rome wanted to paint like Caravaggio, wanted to imitate his manner. Caravaggio initially lived surrounded by artists in a sort of prehistoric version of the bohemian lifestyle, and amidst debauchery, brawls, and violent quarrels. He never abandoned the life of the street and the taverns, even when he was by then an established painter, hosted in the palaces of cardinals. He was part of a world in which painters lived together with poets and expressed their mutual insults in verse, had prostitutes as models, sold paintings in the open market, became involved in scams and thefts, and participated in the life of religious orders, whether by executing modest works or grand altarpieces. They sometimes aspired to live like their patrons, but more often, a part of them found themselves behaving like their soldiers, always on the lookout for a pretext to draw their swords. Someone like Caravaggio, who managed through this Roman period to maintain both the company of his peers and the company of important prelates, spending his time with night-old barbers as much as with Marquis Giustiniani, does not seem out of place in this city, because Rome has always had this close relation between the high and low. We are aware that much of our information on artists' biographies and their relationships with other patrons comes not only from literary text, but also from judicial documents. Today, we shall attempt to understand the context of relationships of Caravaggio in Rome. We do not know nothing about Caravaggio's activities prior to Rome and possess not a single work by him from Lombardy, where he was born, he spent his childhood and trained in the workshop of Simone Peterzano. We can see today how his style evolved through experimentation, study, and genuine flashes of genius in his Roman works. In this creative process, the artist is not alone. Contemporary sources never fail to place Caravaggio within contexts that set him in parallel to or in contrast with contemporary painters. The biography written by Carel van Mander, the one left to us by Giovanni Baglione, and the one included by Joachim von Sandrart in his Deutsche Academy, for example, trace his life in constant parallel with the fortune of Cavalier d'Arpino. Not only biographers, but also his patrons and early collectors compared him at a very early stage with Annibale Carracci and paired his works with the ones by Guido Reni. Caravaggio lived in the city that he loved the most, Rome, and I understand him perfectly, for about 10 years, since 1595 to 1606, when he had to flee because he killed a man, Ranuccio Tommasoni, in a brawl following a game of pallacorda, a sort of paddle. Caravaggio loved Rome with such a passion. Rome with its archaeological past, the building and decorative fervor of the present times, the churches and the palaces, and the emergence of new ideas on art. He explored in Rome a concept relatively new to art history studies, that of friendship and its contrary, envy and enmity. The classical definition of friendship, which accompanies us and illuminates our lives, was provided by the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who first described 3 types of friendship. First, the one based on utility, self-interested. 2, the one that based on pleasure, linked to circumstances such as shared interests and passions, which keep friends united as long as they persist. And finally, the type of friendship that is completely pure. In Caravaggio's personal and professional life, we encounter all 3 these types of friendship, often intertwined. So what I shall attempt to do today is to retrace Caravaggio's early years in Rome in the light of his friendships and enmities with painters and patrons, highlighting the differences and similarities between the collections that feature Caravaggio, above all those of Scipione Borghese, Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, and Vincenzo Giustiniani. And all this in less than an hour. So, we can do it. Let us begin by getting to know these figures, or some of these figures I mentioned. Paul V Borghese, whom you can see here in a portrait from Di Leoni workshop. They were both Ludovico and Ottavio, specialists in portrait painting. And a few years later, in the micro mosaic by Marcello Provenzale, the artist who was the protagonist of the revival of mosaic art in Rome. Giovan Pietro Bellori, author of a biography of Caravaggio published in 1672, also mentions a portrait of Paul V, painted by Caravaggio, which is currently difficult to identify, but may have served as a model for this one. So we have another portrait by Caravaggio to find. At the start of his pontificate, his nephew, Scipione Borghese, the son of the Pope's sister, Hortensia, took the surname Borghese and was elected cardinal. We see him, this is Scipione Borghese, we see him in much later portraits, in the precious drawing at the Morgan Library and now in the exhibition, and in the bust by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, now in the Galleria Borghese, dating from around 1632, is one of the most beautiful portraits by Bernini, with the idea of the lips parted and the sitter that is about to speak. A year later, the cardinal died, leaving his incredible art collection, part of which was already housed in the villa, to his relatives. The villa was depicted in 1636 by Wilhelm Bauer, a German artist. Here is this is a portrait too, but it's a portrait of a building, a special building. Wilhelm Bauer was a German artist, and he painted in this small, very small work, the villa with its park animated by figures. We believe its interiors filled with sculptures and, most likely, by a large number of paintings. This is the villa today. We have a photographer who loves the cloudy sky. We don't have a cloudy sky in Rome, never, but he manages to have a photograph like this. The Caravaggio paintings owned by the Cardinal had already been there for more than 20 years, and, as we shall see, had entered this collection very early on, although probably with little direct connection to the painter. They were certainly not in the room where the surviving ones are now, and they moved about quite a lot during their time within the collection. But this room still reminds us today of many moments in Caravaggio's life, and above all, of his early days linked to young men in white shirts. Scipione Borghese was probably the last patron to have known Caravaggio, since he had become a cardinal nephew in 1605, and Caravaggio would leave Rome in 1606, so they stayed in the same city just for 1 year. Scipione acquired the works of a young Caravaggio from what might be considered a secondary market. That is, he bought them from dealers or from other collections. We see here the Saint Jerome, the Virgin Mary, and the Saint Anna crushing the head of the serpent. This is a very powerful altarpiece that is now in the Galleria Borghese, but it was bought from an altarpiece in the old St. Peter. And the David with the head of Goliath, and the St. John the Baptist. They all come from different collections and from the market, and the exception is probably David with the head of Goliath. This was probably sent by Caravaggio to Scipione as a figurative plea for mercy and to ask for the papal pardon. The head of the giant Goliath is the painter's self-portrait, foreshadowing the death penalty hanging over him following the murder of Ranuccio Tommasoni. So this was sent by the painter directly to Scipione, we believe around 1609. Now, close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself in the center of Rome, out on the street, on a night in a century that is close to his hand, specifically in the summer of 1598. It's the 11th of July, and near Piazza Navona, there has been a brawl. There are witnesses, and the Pope's guards are arriving. A barber's apprentice recognizes two painters, roughly the same age, in their mid-20s. Prospero Orsi, author of grotesque and decorations in palaces, and so known as Prosperino delle Grottesche, and Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. I want to read out the document in archaic Italian, which has been published several times, but I'll summarize the description of Caravaggio. A young man in black, not particularly well-groomed, with black hair and black beard, who stopped to pick up a cloak that had slipped from someone's shoulders during the brawl. So this time he was not involved, he was just a witness. The first reliable records of Caravaggio's presence in Rome, therefore, date back to 1598 and suggest that he had already arrived as early as 1597. And this is the portrait of Caravaggio that has enjoyed enduring popularity. It is confirmed by the non-painted portraits. For example, the drawing that Ottavio Leoni leaves us with an image of Caravaggio corresponding to the description in the court document. Some of his biographers have then fueled the subsequent legend of the artist with a particularly difficult start, describing him upon his arrival on the Roman scene as senza ricapito e senza provvedimento, that is, without a stable support and a regular source of income. Wandering through the workshops of both ordinary and talented artists, producing a few paintings for the market, he sought a patron to protect him and initially worked for clients of moderate standing within modest palaces and modest collections. On one instance, he would refer to one of his earliest patrons, Pandolfo Pucci, as Monsignor Insalata, my Lord Salad, after the sole dish he was served at every meal. Another of his early Roman patrons, Monsignor Fantino Petrignani, was more magnificent, at least on building costs, to the extent that he ruined himself building a palace, which partly collapsed, further increasing the construction costs and dragging the architect, Ottaviano Mascherino, into financial ruin as well. In any case, during these early years, Caravaggio had to accept Spartan accommodation. As the biographer said, he was really short of money. It was also during this period that he is thought to have taken on day-to-day work in the workshop of Lorenzo Siciliano, a rather modest and unknown painter, but a true friend to him. After Caravaggio joined the studio of Giuseppe Cesari, known as the Cavalier d'Arpino, this one, the highly successful painter at that time. An episode that remains not entirely clear, an injury followed by a stay into the hospital of Santa Maria della Consolazione, interrupted this collaboration and also strained the friendship between Caravaggio, the Cavalier d'Arpino, and his brother Bernardino Cesari, a less gifted painter but a major figure in the city's nightlife. The latter apparently did not wish to attend to Caravaggio's health, and he was therefore taken to hospital, probably by Lorenzo Siciliano. His stay at the Ospedale della Consolazione, for whose prior Caravaggio produced several works, they are to be found again, appears to be a watershed in the artist's early life, a testing ground that transformed his initial Roman encounters into lasting friendships or into their opposite. While it marked his separation from the Cesari brothers, made his relationship with Carli stronger and stronger, and probably also increased his friendship with the physician Giulio Mancini. Furthermore, during the convalescence that followed, his name began to appear alongside that one of Prospero Orsi, the figure who was in many respects decisive for his entire Roman career. Here we see a work by Cavalier d'Arpino, The Taking of Christ, now in the Galleria Borghese, a nice scene, so deeply influenced already by the presence of Caravaggio in his studio. Through his friendship with Prospero, who broke with Cavalier d'Arpino at the same time as Caravaggio did, we don't know if whether out of solidarity, this we don't know, Caravaggio met other important and very relevant patrons like Cardinal Del Monte. But let us return for a moment to Cavalier d'Arpino, who had a workshop full of young painters who came from all over Italy and even from the north of Europe. He wanted to live, he was one of the painters that wanted to live like his patrons and played a central role in the city's artistic life. Yet even he was not far from the violence that seems to accompany and at times even pervade the lives of painters. It was in fact thanks to an episode in which Cavalier d'Arpino found himself at odds with the papal authorities that Caravaggio's early paintings came to be part of Scipione Borghese's collection. This refers to the famous episode of the seizure of Cavalier d'Arpino assets, which took place in 1607 when the Cavaliere property was confiscated after he was accused of injuring another painter, as he had taken an important commission away from him. The guards who went to the Cavalier d'Arpino home and workshop found a veritable arsenal, weapons and of all kinds that the painter was not authorized to possess. He was faced with a choice: either a sentence that seemed inevitable or the gift of his collection to the Pope. As part of this settlement, the Cavaliere donated the entire contents of his workshop, which contained over 100 paintings, to the Apostolic Chamber. Almost immediately, the day after, the assets were transferred to Cardinal Scipione Borghese, the nephew of the Pope Paul V. Among the paintings mostly executed by Giuseppe Cesari, the Cavalier d'Arpino, and by his brother Bernardino, and Flemish painters who had passed through the workshop, were Caravaggio's early masterpieces, the sick Bacchus and the boy with the basket of fruits. A painting and some still lifes like this one, so we don't forget about the still lifes by other painters than Caravaggio. This is by an anonymous painter, but a very gifted one. Is called the Master of Artford, and a lot of landscapes by northern painters. They are at the Galleria Borghese too, but nobody watched them. So, a painting of a boy who was being beaten and was screaming in sudden pain, a work that is no longer in the Borghese collection, but which we might perhaps imagine to be similar to one of the versions of the boy beaten by a lizard, was part of the collection of the Cavalier d'Arpino and was brought to the house of the Cardinal Borghese, but this is not in the Galleria Borghese anymore. The boy displays a grimace of surprise and pain, and those natural objects caressed by light are not harmless, but harbor a hidden danger, the lizard biting the boy's finger. He too wears a white shirt, yet he seems almost dressed in the fashion of the ancient Roman style, with one shoulder bare and a rose in his hair. He knows he's a character and knows he's been watched by us. Although Caravaggio studies this aspect of his figures here, which he would refine in the years to come, memories of his apprenticeship pervade this image. Original flashes of inspiration are not enough to mask the underlying debate on the representation of passions, the moti, the feelings, whether subtle or violent, that the painter was required to investigate and depict were a subject of 16th century debates, and painters had devoted themselves both to defining the sudden movement imprinted on bodies due to sudden pain and to defining the comic style, which grouped together secular paintings without specific subject, like this one. The Boy Bitten by a Lizard was also a great success, judging by the number of copies and the critical debate surrounding the two examples most widely accepted as the originals, the painting currently at the National Gallery in London, that we are seeing here, and the one at the Longhi, Fondazione Longhi in Florence. According to a footnote in Giulio Mancini's text, this was the first painting Caravaggio managed to sell, and it marked the painter's decision to try and go to stay alone, to leave other artists' workshops and launch himself into the art market. Conversely, Giovanni Baglione reports that nobody wanted these paintings. And the intervention of a dealer was necessary to help Caravaggio survive through the sale of his early works. But I brought the image of this painting to understand the significance of the owner's action in guiding the interpretation of the works. In fact, I suggest we should carefully read the first description of the Villa Borghese, drawn up in 1650, when the manager of the house, Giacomo Manilli, describing the room in which this painting, or a copy of this painting, was located, mentions it standing next to a wooden box, from which a screaming head suddenly emerged. We have, of course, lost this object, which must have resembled one of the late Renaissance automatic robots already described in the second half of the 16th century. But we can imagine that it restored the auditory element to Caravaggio painting. So I didn't find nothing better than this to show the idea of the emerging head from a box, so a sort of Jack in the Box. Walking through the rooms of the Borghese collection, one could hear the sound of the painting and will explore the idea of being scared by something that happened suddenly. But now we go back for a moment to the sick Bacchus. Here we come to know the painter not only by observing his skill in portraying ordinary people and creating still lifes, but we discover him in his first self-portrait. We see him in the guise of Bacchus, the god of poetic inspiration, as he turns towards the viewer in a pose that is perhaps a little awkward. His face is pale, almost grayish, with livid lips and wide-open eyes, and his head is crowned with ivy, its leaves small, very green, and abundant. Among the various properties of ivy, a symbol of eternity and eternal affection, there was a legend that it cured drunkenness. Who knows whether this face of a young man dressed in the style of the ancient Roman portrayed in the mirror is that of the painter given over to the excesses of wine, or is a vulnerable and sickly image of the artist in a difficult moment of his life. Caravaggio had been treated by the barber, and he ended up, as we already said, at the Ospitale della Consolazione, where he was also assisted by Giulio Mancini. Much of what we know about Caravaggio's early years is in fact thanks to Mancini, who wrote a biography of Caravaggio and who saw him frail and suffering, who knew of paintings sold for few coins, for few scudi. But why Caravaggio chose Bacchus to capture his Roman image, and why, moreover, such a bedraggled Bacchus? The Bacchus that Renaissance inherited from the ancient world is a figure who, over time, became an inspirer of artists. I quote, "It is not possible for those who forget you to compose a sweet song," reads the Homeric hymn dating back to the 7th century BC. And already in the Iliad, Dionysus, the Greek god called Bacchus by Romans, is remembered as the son of Jupiter and praised in contemporary poems for his invention of wine. Caravaggio's Bacchus, who is pressing grapes, if you look carefully, is pressing grapes with the two hands. He's inventing wine. Is Bacchus in the moment of the creative furor? Is the artist exhausted by his work who divinely brings consolation to mankind? Battered yet powerful, disturbing yet inspiring, the self-portrait appearing behind the great parapet upon which a bunch of grapes and other fruits are arranged is the first powerful experiment in what Caravaggio would achieve in his artistic career, casting a fresh gaze upon the power of images from the past, reinventing them, and inventing a new language that blends biography and the originality of painting. Bacchus has borrowed one of the shirts or clothes that suited the boy bitten by a lizard, and a hint of the still life that triumphs in the boy with a basket of fruit. It lies in the same years, perhaps in the same months, and in the same thoughts. They are all isolated images, almost tangible in their stillness, devoid as they are of setting and supporting figures that might link them to the familiar scenarios of the myth. The characters of ancient fables acquire the contemporaneity and fixity of portraiture, as in his later works, the Bacchus in the Uffizi, the victorious Cupid, now in Berlin, and the small sleeping Cupid from his years in Malta, now in Palazzo Pitti. We can almost imagine Michelangelo Merisi, the Lombard painter thrown into the Roman arena, standing before his first Bacchus and pondering the comments of those who did not consider him capable of speaking the language of imitation of ancient sculpture. Do you want mythology? I have a fever, and so does your Bacchus. Look at the state he is in. More ambitious compositions were to come in the subsequent times, like this one. This is one of the most successful compositions by Caravaggio, The Fortune Teller. We know in two different versions, one in the Louvre and one in Rome. The gypsy, the zingara, the young woman reading the palm of the naive young man, marks the turning point in the life of Caravaggio, because Cardinal Del Monte was fond of this painting and asked Caravaggio to become one of the artists in his household. So Caravaggio, thanks to this friendship with Prospero Orsi, was making rapid progress on the market and on the collections. He was able to sell some 3 paintings to the Vitrice family. They were related to Prospero by marriage, and they were and these are really wonderful masterpieces by Caravaggio at the end of the 16th century. So they are still in his manner of, full of light with warm colors. They are clear light style, brilliant colors, traces of landscape sometimes. Look here, this is such a beautiful and amazing landscape for a painter who really had to give up painting landscapes in all his career, and warm light effects and the imitation of the model. These are the characteristics of this group, which would later pass from the Vitrice family to the Pamphili collection. The Gypsy we have seen now in the Louvre, the Penitent Magdalene we have already seen, and the rest on the flight into Egypt. They were all in the Pamphili collection. The collection of Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte included a second Gypsy, the car sharps, now at the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, and the concert, this one, now in New York, full of boys in white shirts, and also with a small figure of Cupid with the dark wings. Del Monte protected Caravaggio and was the first patron to offer him the opportunity to study his collection, to listen to music in his palace, and to make a name for himself in a milieu where the experience of the arts was considered not merely a means of displaying one's social status and the family's importance, but crucial to intellectual and spiritual life. In this sense, the greatest collector of the early 17th century was Vincenzo Giustiniani, a banker of Genoese origin who turned his palace into a heaven for artists, where the fruitful exchange of ideas on art continued until the 1630s, but certainly began with Caravaggio, of whom Giustiniani owned more than 10 paintings. And they were, all of them, most all of them, directly commissioned from the painter. He too was a music lover, and this is reflected in the marvelous lute player by Caravaggio, now at the Hermitage Museum, where Caravaggio was able to pair not only the figure of the boy with the white shirt and playing music, but also this wonderful still life of flowers. And the portrait of this young musician was probably the portrait of a guest of Vincenzo Giustiniani during the same years that Caravaggio frequented this palace whilst living with the Del Monte family, and from 1601 with Girolamo Mattei. He learned a lot in these years, I'm sure about that, and he made for Vincenzo Giustiniani one of his absolute masterpieces, the wonderful Victorious Cupid we already mentioned, now in Berlin museums. It was covered at that time by a green curtain that I tried to reproduce with my means, so I'm sorry for that. But there was a Greek silk curtain covering this famous Amore Vincitore, the Victorious Cupid. The idea of concealing the painting was the one of preventing it from overshadowing the other 120 works which were exhibited in the same gallery as this painting. Some 20 years later, Vincenzo Giustiniani received a proposal by someone that was not specified, a foreign knight that he wished to buy the victorious Cupid from Vincenzo Giustiniani, and he proposed an exorbitant price, but Vincenzo refused, saying that this painting was unique, and so he couldn't make a price for this because there was no painter anymore in Rome able to do something like this. So it was totally irrepressible. So the painting was shown only after the viewing of the other rarities had concluded, and so it was not to prejudice their appreciation. This account, alongside the existence of a scarce number of copies of this painting relative to the prevalence of the subject iconography within the Caravaggio tradition, seems to illustrate the methods of accessing the Giustiniani collection and also of viewing Caravaggio's works, together with some theatrical means. It has often been thought that the work was kept covered out of moral scruples. But, in fact, the idea of the final unveiling to convey the aesthetic experience in an emphasized manner, linked to the wonder aroused as a climax by the exceptional works of art collected by Vincenzo Giustiniani. So this is extremely consistent with what can be inferred from the layout of the collection, in which amazement, surprise, and even irony appear to play a decisive role. The painting enjoyed a lot of success in poetry as early as the beginning of the century, likely not long after its creation, apparently in competition with other contemporary works, such as those painted by Giovanni Baglione for Benedetto Giustiniani, the brother of the Marquis Vincenzo. The story of the painting depicting sacred love subduing the profane love by Giovanni Baglione is closely linked to the idea of friendship and envy. It is Baglione himself, the author of this painting that was inspired by the Cupid by Caravaggio, but really far from it. Baglione recounts in his autobiography that he had painted a version of the sacred love subduing the profane love, which, although it did not please as much as Caravaggio's, earned him a gold chain from Benedetto Giustiniani. There are two versions of the subject, both from the Giustiniani collection. One is now in Berlin, and the other, this one, is in Rome, in the Galleria Nazionale of the Arte Antica in Palazzo Barberini. The Roman version is dated 1602. Orazio Gentileschi, another fellow painter, during the lawsuit brought by Baglione against Caravaggio in 1603, spoke of an adult armed Cupid painted by Baglione, to which he had objected its lack of coherence with the sources, the ancient sources, which described love as naked and a kid. As well as being an indirect praise of this feature in the image painted by Caravaggio, these words seem to have prompted Baglione to produce a second version. In any case, The Giustiniani collection also stands as a theater of friendship and enmity, a place where opposing forces could be seen at work. Caravaggio and Baglione, Vincenzo and his brother Benedetto. The contrast between past and present, between the 16th century past and the new languages of painting, between the plastic power of sculpture and the dramatic character of the new dramatic painting, all speaks of rivalry between artists and of theoretical antinomies. Not only friendship, but envy made their way through the workshops and palaces, and envy was spreading its black wings over the entire city, according to a powerful image created by Karel van Mander, who speaks in these terms of the world of painters at the beginning of the 17th century. Caravaggio lived, like the other artists, in this shadow of the black wings of envy. But whenever he could, he pinned them to Cupid's back. Not only with the little Cupid of the concert we already saw, but with this image, more powerful than any other, with this boy without a white shirt, but with black wings on his shoulders, who laughs at human ambitions and declares the triumph of love over every other human passion, arts and power and everything. At the same time, Caravaggio declares all his love for his Roman life and for the art of painting. Thank you.